And today I'm here with Kathy Kendall-Tackett, who's a friend and a colleague and someone I've been partnering with to run these healing birth trauma series. This is our second one. It's called Birth Trauma and the Professional Care for the Staff, something that both Kathy and I feel very passionate about. So Kathy, would you say a little bit more about yourself and what you're going to talk about?
Sure. I'm a health psychologist and board certified lactation consultant. And I actually edit the journal for the American Psychological Association called Psychological Trauma. So, trauma has been something that I've been interested in for many, many, many years. And most of my area has a lot been focused on things like interpersonal trauma. However, this idea of birth trauma is something that for probably about 30 years I've been writing about. And I've just written an article recently with Dr. Cheryl Beck at the University of Connecticut, looking at both secondary trauma in providers and something called moral injury. And moral injury prior to COVID had always been used in a military context. But I remember actually kind of reading through some articles. We were doing a special issue for the journal on trauma in the military. And I'm reading through all these military articles, and they had a bunch on moral injury and stuff. And I'm reading through and I'm thinking, good Lord, you know, it exactly fit what Cheryl had written about and had called secondary trauma, which at the time was really kind of the best label. And so, kind of what we tried to do in this new article is take some of her data that, her qualitative data that she called secondary trauma and really apply this construct called moral injury. And basically, moral injury has to do with this idea that you're being kind of forced to participate or you're a bystander to or an observer of something that you think is wrong. And this has been coming up so much during COVID. I mean, not just even within birthing, but within medical in general, that everybody kind of finding, times when they are forced to do something that they think is wrong. And there were so many examples of this with COVID, with birthing personnel. I was getting emails all the time from my friends who were lactation consultants or they were labor and delivery nurses. And they say, you cannot believe what is going on in our hospital. This is just horrible. Lots of mother-baby separation, mothers laboring by themselves. There was a lot of legislative stuff. So what I try to do is actually bring that into kind of a context to talk about, this is another way providers can be affected. So I talk about burnout and then secondary trauma and moral injury. And what's kind of been interesting is I've had people say, like in comments and stuff and during question and answer, they'll say stuff like, I thought I was burned out, but I think what I actually have is moral injury.
Yeah. Moral injury or PTS or variations of that.
Right. Well, and what's been kind of interesting is the evolution of this construct. Again, like I said, it up until very recently, it had all been in military context, but it was this idea that you're looking at kind of more the existential variables like right and wrong.
Right.
And so that's something that psychologists a lot of times they haven't been interested in, but their clients are. They feel like that they violated some personal norm. And there's even some interesting literature about how this affects like religiosity and spirituality. Like sometimes what happens is people think this is so horrible, I cannot possibly continue to be a believer. I don't believe in God anymore if he allowed this to happen. Or the other thing is it changes their faith, expands to include that sometimes really awful things happen. And so it's an expansion. So you kind of get one or the other. And what like psychologists have realized is if they don't sort of address some of these morality kinds of issues, and it's very difficult to treat the trauma because you've got this sort of guilt and shame layer and feeling like you don't deserve to actually get better. Now, the other thing that was interesting too is like what we've seen in the military literature is it was often acts of omission that were actually the most problematic. And I think that's actually directly relevant to what happens to, say, doulas and labor delivery nurses, lactation consultants, who are observers to something that is awful and they couldn't do anything about it, but they feel like they should have been able to.
Right. Okay, well, it'll be very interesting to hear all the things that you have to say. I certainly look forward to being with you. Kathy Kendall-Tackett's presentation is the 7th of September. It's called When Helping Hurts, Secondary Traumatic Stress and Moral Injury Among Birth Workers. So we look forward to having you there, Kathy, and we start with our series in August. Information about the series is connected to this video, and we'll see you there.